Okay, so today we're opening up a wonderfully twisted survival guide. If you've ever flipped through the Class 10 English textbook, First Flight, you've probably stumbled across a pretty unique poem by Carolyn Wells called How to Tell Wild Animals. Now, normally, when we want to learn about wildlife, we turn to scientific facts, biology, safety manuals, but Carolyn Wells, she completely throws that rulebook out the window. Instead, she gives us this darkly humorous breakdown of how to identify some of the most dangerous predators on the planet. I'm honestly so excited to guide you through this explainer, because it's literally a masterclass in using absolute absurdity to teach us something new.
So, think about this. How exactly do you, as just a casual forest wanderer, identify a wild animal? Well, according to the twisted irony of this poem, by letting it attack you, of course. I mean, the sheer comedic genius here is that the only way to truly know what wild beast you are looking at is to basically become its lunch. She trades helpful scientific descriptions for these funny, highly exaggerated situations where the main method of animal identification is, well, a fatal encounter. It's ridiculous, it's a bit morbid, and it absolutely hooks you right in.
Section 1. Identifying the big cats.
All right, we're heading straight into the jungles of the East to identify some of the most majestic and definitely deadly threats out there. Picture this. You're traveling through the eastern jungles and a large, yellowish-brown animal approaches you. You're probably wondering, is this a lion or something else? Well, the poem gives us a totally foolproof test. If the animal roars loudly at you with zero mercy, congratulations, you've just identified the Asian lion. But wait, what about the Bengal tiger? Well, if a large beast with black stripes attacks and actually eats you, then, as the victim, you will know for certain it was a Bengal tiger. The dark humor here is just brilliant, right? You only figure out the animal's identity after the attack is already underway.
And this perfectly highlights a wonderful contrast happening in the poem. The rhyme scheme is this neatly structured, highly predictable AB-AB pattern. So while you're actively being digested by a tiger or roared at by a merciless lion, the poet just keeps up this light, bouncy, perfectly ordered rhythm. It creates this fantastic friction between the incredibly violent situations being described and the cheerful, sing-song way they're being delivered to us.
Section 2. The Pouncers and the Huggers. Moving right along in this frankly highly ineffective survival guide, we get to the phrase, "lep and lep again." This is just a fantastic visual anchor for our next encounter. You've probably noticed that the word leap is wonderfully misspelled as lep. The poet uses this literary device of repetition not just to keep that bouncy rhythm going, but to actually physically mimic the relentless, aggressive jumping of our next predator, the spotted leopard. Even the spelling itself feels fast and aggressive, just like the animal.
Let's break these two encounters down real quick. If you see a spotted animal walking around and it starts jumping on you repeatedly, leaping and leaping, yep, you've got a leopard. And the poet adds a great touch of humor here by explicitly pointing out that no matter how many times you cry or scream, it's not going to help you. The leopard's just going to keep jumping. Now contrast that incredibly violent pouncing with the bear. If you meet a bear in the forest, do not, for a second, be fooled into thinking it's friendly. The bear's whole method of identification is greeting you with a very, very tight hug. It's vivid, it's deceptively affectionate, and it is an utterly fatal embrace.
Section 3. Hugs, smiles, and tears.
Okay, so we're moving from straight-up aggressive physical attacks to predators that use some really unsettling human-like deception. The poet rightfully notes that a beginner might find it pretty tricky to distinguish between certain wild animals. So, how do we tell them apart? We look at their faces. If an animal is smiling while attacking you, it's probably a hyena, because they look like they're laughing or grinning. On the flip side, if tears come into the animal's eyes while it's actively eating its prey, you've got a crocodile. The poet is using personification so effectively here, applying these distinctively human expressions, smiling and weeping, to help us distinguish between two terrifying predators.
And that actually brings us to a very specific cultural definition: crocodile tears. We use this to mean fake tears, or a false, totally insincere display of emotion. The crucial point here is that the poet isn't just making up some random biological trait for the crocodile, she's brilliantly employing illusion. She taps into this well-known idiom to characterize the crocodile's deceptive weeping while it casually enjoys its meal. It makes the animals instantly recognizable through our own cultural touchstones rather than dry biological facts.
Section 4. The Invisible Chameleon.
Which leads us perfectly to the final and honestly, probably the most absurd animal in Carolyn Wells' Deadly Bestiary. The logic here is absolutely brilliant. So, the chameleon is a small lizard-like creature famous for changing its color to match its surroundings, right? But the poet gives us the most brilliantly useless, humorous clue ever to identify it. Imagine you look at a tree. You see absolutely no color at all. You see literally nothing. Well, therefore, it must be a chameleon, because it's blended perfectly into the environment. We are literally identifying a creature based entirely on our total inability to see it. It's pretty much the peak of comedic irony in the entire poem.
Section 5. The Mechanics of Humor.
So, having survived, or let's be real, more likely not survived, our little walk through the jungle, let's pull back the curtain and see how this all actually works. Notice just how many tools Wells uses to trick us into learning. She actively ditches factual science and swaps it out for pure imaginative exaggeration. She uses humor and irony, literally making us wait until we're being eaten to identify the tiger. She uses repetition, like the lep and lep of the leopard, to mimic its aggression. She uses powerful imagery to help us feel that deadly hug of the bear. She brings an illusion with the crocodile tears, and personification by giving the hyena that super sinister, human-like smile. Every single literary device here is doing some seriously heavy lifting to ensure that while we are reading about deadly, terrifying predators, we are actually grinning from ear to ear.
Section 6. Why humor helps us learn.
So why does this poem actually work so well as an educational tool? I mean, it's sitting right there in a Class 10 textbook. Well, there are 3 core themes at play here. First up, humor and danger. The poem takes genuinely terrifying encounters and turns them into funny, bite-sized, digestible situations. Second, nature and wildlife. Because despite all the jokes, it genuinely does introduce readers to different wild animals and their key, well-known characteristics. And finally, imagination and creativity. By using wildly imaginative descriptions instead of dry facts, Carolyn Wells proves her ultimate point, that poetry can successfully combine real wildlife information with sheer unadulterated amusement. It goes to show that learning doesn't have to be dry to be incredibly effective.
The biggest takeaway from all of this is really about how we approach the unknown. Carolyn Wells looked at literally the deadliest beasts on Earth and just decided to laugh at them. So I'll leave you with this. Next time you're learning something scary, incredibly intimidating, or just overly complex, could a little dark humor be your absolute best survival tool? Think about it. Thanks so much for joining me on this wild walk through the jungle for today's explainer, and hey, keep that imagination sharp.